Here now in our fourth class under the series that we've been considering the trials of Paul, this morning is entitled Before the Governor. And last week, under the care of Claudius Lysias, who was the chief captain, Paul had been escorted under the cover of night from Jerusalem, and he was going to be brought down into the custody of Felix the governor in Cesarea Maritima. And here in this coastal city, he is going to do three things. He is going to inform the governor with a clear motive. He is going to answer with a clear conscience. And he is going to reason with a clear message. And he is going to do all this in the city of Cesarea Maritima. Now, if you open your Bibles with me to Acts chapter 23 and 24, this is the city where the Apostle Paul is going to spend the remaining of our three classes together under the trials of Paul. Because this morning he's going to be brought before the Governor Felix. Next week, God willing, he's going to be brought before the judge, who will be Festus. And finally, he will be brought before the king, Agrippa II. But it will all take place here in Cesarea Maritima. Now, brothers and sisters, this city was an absolute marvel in the Roman world. Now, here's what we read of those who have gone before, and they have studied this city, unearthed its treasures and its geography. And here is what Barbara Burgeon says in her paper entitled The Innovative Genius of Herod at Cesarea Maritima. She says that Herod the Great created a harbor named Sebastus and a modern city called Caesarea. Here, Herod constructed a totally man-made port directly into the open sea, a totally revolutionary idea. Herod brought together architects, engineers, Roman master builders, and Jewish artisans to construct his dream. The city was surrounded by a protective wall, which comprised a temple, a unique terraced palace on an exposed site, a theater, a hippostadium, and street system with aligned underground sewers. Herod brought together East and West, integrating the best of the traditions in a magnificent port city. It became the center of maritime trade between Rome and Alexandria. And it really was the elbow of the commercial trading system that was in that day. And Herod the Great had created this city. It was a marvel of the Roman world. And perhaps maybe some of us have even been there, or have at least been in the vicinity. And so there on the left, an artist's rendering of what it looked like at its height. And there today is the coastal remains of Cesarea Maritima on the right. If you were to look at it from the sea, you would see the vast expanse of this great city and how integral it would have been for commercial trade. And this is the location where Paul would be brought, and he would be kept in Herod's judgment hall. Now, Herod's judgment hall was a part of Herod's palace. And Herod's palace must have been a magnificent structure built right out into the open sea, surrounded, as it were, on each side of by the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea. And if you actually go to Cesarea Maritima, this is there, placarded there amongst the ruins of the old city, and just gives you an idea of the scale of how big this palace was, where Herod's judgment hall also was, and this is where the Apostle Paul was brought. And here is sort of a constructed view, computer view, and this you see Herod's judgment hall in Herod's palace. And so there would have been Herod's palace. It would have been a place where he would have brought in important figures, people from all throughout the Roman world to come and see this marvel of a city that he had built. And just there in the back, sort of in the coast, this would have been where Herod's judgment hall would have been. And this is where the Apostle Paul was brought. And this is where he'll remain for our next three classes, before the governor, before the judge, and before the king. Now, if you look at verse 1 of Acts chapter 24, this is where the Apostle Paul was going to wait, having been brought down from Jerusalem, for his accusers to come. They would need to leave Jerusalem themselves and come to Cesarea Maritima. And it says in verse 1 of Acts 24, and after 5 days, Ananias, the high priest, descended with the elders. And so here we have Ananias himself, the high priest. He is going to personally come and make sure that everything is done to his liking. And he is going to be accompanied with a certain individual, because in verse 1 also, it says, accompanying Ananias and the elders was a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. So there was a Jewish contingent, and there was a Roman contingent. And Ananias is going to be the master of the law of Moses. And Tertullus is going to be the master of the law of Rome. And so these two individuals, Ananias and Tertullus, they are going to stand as a two-pronged attack against the Apostle Paul. Ananias, a master of the law of Moses, and Tertullus, a master in the law of Rome. They had everything covered. It's remarkable to think of their names, too. Really gives us a good idea of who they were. But Ananias, his name means gracious. And it's not that he was gracious, but that he cast a persona that he was gracious. After all, he was a high priest. But Tertullus' name means triple hardened. And boy, he must have been an absolute man in demand when you had cases such as this, that you wanted him to come and be a part of your sort of team here in Herod's judgment hall. After all, you see in verse 1, not only was Tertullus triple hardened, so he was out for business, but he was an orator. Now that word orator in verse 1 is the only time it's ever mentioned in the New Testament, and here's what it means. It means the act of persuasive speaking. Now, interestingly, that word orator, the Greek word, is where we get the word rhetoric from. So you ever heard the word rhetoric? Well, rhetoric, you can sort of get lost in the rhetoric of a conversation. What's going on there? The rhetoric. Okay, but Tertullus, he was a professional persuasive speaker. And Ananias and the elders were all too eager to have him as a part of their team. And so you have a master of the law of Moses and a master in the law of Rome, and they are now going to descend upon Cesarea Maritima, and they are going to establish their case. Now, it's worth sort of understanding what the case was going to be that they were going to try and establish against the Apostle Paul. And so if you want to break it down, from verse 2 to 8 is when Tertullus is going to speak. So here, the orator Tertullus, he is going to have an argument, and it's going to be broken down in 3 ways. Verse 2 to 4, he is going to use feigned adulations. He's going to flatter Felix, the governor. From verses 5 to 6, he's going to now employ false accusations against the Apostle Paul. And very cleverly, in the conclusion of his speech, verse 7 to 8, he's going to use a fierce aggravation and discredit a witness. Oh, brothers and sisters, not only was Tertullus an expert in rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, but he must have been a high-priced lawyer. And I'm sure he didn't charge by the hour. He probably charged by the case. And this is the man who is now going to step forward, and he is going to give his set of arguments here in Herod's judgment hall in Cesarea Maritima. Now just notice in the opening segment of his argument, verses 2 to 4, notice the oozing flattery that he's going to lavish upon Governor Felix. And here we read verse 2 of Acts chapter 24. And when Paul was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, Seeing that we enjoy great quietness, Governor Felix, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words. You can just imagine 3 whole verses of his argument is going to be devoted just to feigned adulations. So you notice, brothers and sisters, what he has said in verses 2 to 4. Verse 2, he says of Governor Felix that under his governorship, that they enjoyed great quietness. The phrase means peace and tranquility. Also in verse 2, he says of Governor Felix that he had very worthy deeds. And at the end of verse 2, he said that the nation had enjoyed his providence. Verse 3, he acknowledged that Governor Felix was most noble, and the word noble means honorable. And finally, at the end of verse 4, he asked that out of his clemency, Tertullus might speak a few words, and the word clemency means gentleness. This was Tertullus, and he was going to offer feigned adulations. Now, we'll get to why it's completely ironic the way that Tertullus opens his argument in a second. But, brothers and sisters, it's interesting to think there are many individuals in the Bible who employed the use of flattery. I'm going to try and make a distinction between flattery and one other element which we might employ. But look at this group. Times in the Bible, those who employed deceptive flattery. So obviously we have Tertullus here in Acts 24, verse 1 to 2. The Judaizers. Paul mentions that they were using flattery in Romans 16, verse 18. The captive Jews who came before Ezekiel in Ezekiel 33, verse 31. How about this individual? In Daniel 11, verse 32, Antiochus, his chief employment of strategic maneuvering was to use flattery. And no doubt, in Matthew 15, verse 8, the religious leaders, they employed flattery. Now, here's maybe a distinction. You might have a think about this. But flattery benefits the flatterer. So when someone is employing flattery, it really actually benefits the person who is saying it. Because no doubt here in Tertullus's case, verse 2 to 4, he is lavishing flattery upon Felix, which we'll get to in a second, which is untrue, so that he, Tertullus, might benefit. So think about it. Flattery benefits the flatterer, but what about compliments? Because we do give compliments from time to time, and I think there is a distinction. Compliments benefit the complimented. So not to say that if someone has done something or might have something nice little compliment, not saying that that's wrong, because the compliment benefits the complimented, but flattery benefits the flatterer. And here is why I titled it Feigned Adulations that Tertullus was using. This is from the guidebook of the New Testament, and this is who Felix was. Felix was noted for extreme ruthlessness and cruelty. Tacitus declares that during his governorship of Judea, he indulged in all kinds of cruelty and lust, exercising regal power with the disposition of a slave, and considering himself as licensed to commit any crime. For example, having a grudge against Jonathan, the high priest, who had expostulated with him on this misrule, he made use of Doris, an intimate friend of Jonathan, in order to get him assassinated by a gang of villains who joined the crowds that were going up to the temple to worship, a crime which led to countless evils by the encouragement which it gave to the Sicarii, or leagued assassins of the day. It is to their excesses that Josephus ascribes under providence, the overthrow of the Jewish state. And you can read on and on about this most noble Felix. He was anything but what Tertullus had claimed. And the interesting thing is everyone in that judgment hall knew who Felix was. But it didn't stop Tertullus from offering feigned adulations. And if everyone in the judgment hall knew who Felix was, then everyone in that judgment hall knew who Tertullus was. And Tertullus was the plaintiff. Now you see that word in verse 2 of Acts 24. Tertullus began to accuse Paul. That word accuse, it means to be a plaintiff. Now a plaintiff in a court of law is the side that brings forth the charges. They're the ones that are bringing the charges so that they might condemn the defendant. And in this case, that's the Apostle Paul. And that's what that word means in Acts 24 and verse 2. And this is a very key word, brothers and sisters. If you look back in Acts 23 and verse 28, you might like to put some color on it or maybe circle at least. But this word accuse in the English occurs numerous times here in Acts 23 and Acts 24. For example, Acts 23 verse 28. Claudius Lysias in his letters said, verse 28 of Acts 23, "And when I would have known the cause wherefore they accused him." Verse 29, "Whom I perceive to be accused of questions of their law." And in verse 30, the end of the letter of Acts 23, Lysias says, "And I gave commandment to his accusers." And finally, the last verse of Acts 23, "I will hear thee, said Felix, when thine accusers are come." And on it goes. And you can't help but notice that this is going to be one of the key words, and Tertullus is going to be at the front of this key word, the plaintiff, to bring the charges against the Apostle Paul. Now, what were the charges? In verse 5 and 6, Tertullus is going to give for us 4 specific charges, and they are aimed at discrediting anything the Apostle Paul has done up to the point of even bringing a death sentence against him. And here are the charges, verse 5 of Acts 24. "For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also," verse 6, "hath gone about to profane the temple." And here are the 4 charges which Tertullus is going to bring and make accusation against the Apostle Paul. And they're sort of demarcated by the word "and." Verse 5, "A pestilent fellow, a mover of sedition, a ringleader," and in verse 6, "a profaner." Now, notice what Tertullus is doing as he's sort of building his argument. And it might be sort of helpful to sort of put them in their proper category. This is what Tertullus has laid in terms of charges against the Apostle Paul. He starts off with Roman charges because he wants to arrest the attention of Governor Felix by making these Roman political charges. And here they are. He said that the Apostle Paul was a pestilent fellow, a mover of sedition, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And then in verse 6, after he has established a heavy bout of Roman political charges, he establishes Jewish charges, and they're spiritual, because he said that the Apostle Paul was a profaner of the temple. You can't help but notice that this is all planned. So like on the way down from Jerusalem, you said, Ananias and Tertullus they're talking, and how are we going to approach it? Here's the plan. We're going to establish Roman charges first, arrest the attention of Governor Felix, and then we'll just bring in, for our sakes, Jewish charges. And if you were to look even closer at it on your own time, a pestilent fellow, a mover of sedition, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. They get bigger and bigger and bigger and more important. But they were illegal. Because you could not do what these charges said you were doing, because you would be in danger of breaking Roman law. Now, in the speeches of the Acts by John Carter, there was something called Pax Romana, and what that means is called Roman peace. And if you were to break Roman peace, and Tertullus claimed that Paul had done this, you could suffer the death penalty even as a Roman. So here's what Speeches in the Acts by John Carter on page 100 says. Tertullus, by calling the religion of Paul and his associates a sect, a heresy of the Nazarenes, was saying that they were not in any way to be recognized as identified with the Jewish religion, and therefore could not enjoy the privilege of freedom that the Jewish nation enjoyed. But since the Jewish nation had been granted this freedom of worship, since their religion had been legalized under the law of the Roman Empire, they were entitled to the protection of the authorities against anything that went against their practices. And that was true. The Roman Empire had said that the Jews were able to practice their religion. But what Tertullus had said is that Paul's sect of the Nazarenes was not the Jewish religion. So what he is doing is breaking Roman peace. And notice this at the end of his speech here, verse 6, 7, and 8. He is now going to discredit the only witness that the Apostle Paul might have. And that was the chief captain who had written the letter to Felix in chapter 23. And notice how he discredits the chief captain. Verse 6 of Acts 24. Governor Felix, we had grabbed the Apostle Paul, whom we took, and we would have judged according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And you notice what he does here, Tertullus, at the end of his speech. He says that Governor Felix, we would have handled this ourselves, and not had brought this all the way down and taken up your time. But that pesky chief captain Lysias, he came and he disrupted the proceedings that we had going. And so what has Tertullus done? He has lavished feigned adulations upon Governor Felix. He has laid numerous charges against the Apostle Paul, which would have brought the sentence of death had they been proven true. And he has discredited the only witness that the Apostle Paul might have brought forward. So Tertullus, he certainly earned his keep. And so much so, verse 9, and the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. Case closed. So what would you do if you were the Apostle Paul? Well, if you come with me to Matthew chapter 10, I think that there might have been something in the mind of the Apostle Paul before he was brought forward and given permission to speak and make his defense. And it's remarkable, brothers and sisters, to think in times of challenge and in times when we are given opportunity to speak, we think upon old things that we remember and they come into a new understanding. And here is something that the Lord Jesus Christ had said in his ministry, and undoubtedly they would have come and flashed upon the mind of the Apostle Paul before he spoke. Verse 16 of Matthew chapter 10. Jesus said in sending out his disciples, verse 16, behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils, and they will scourge you in their synagogues. And ye shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, take no thought how or what you shall speak, for it shall be given you in that same hour what you shall speak. For it is not ye that speak, but the Spirit of your Father, which speaketh in you. You see, this was a promise that the Lord had made when he sent out his disciples, and certainly it held true when they became apostles. And the Lord was saying that at the moment that they needed to have the words, when they were brought before governors and kings, they would be provided. Now here's something to think about, brothers and sisters, and I invite discussion, but because of time afterwards, seriously. Jesus is not saying that the Spirit would teach them new things. So in the hour of need, when the apostle needed to speak, Jesus is not saying the Spirit's going to teach you new things. But Jesus was saying that the Spirit would help them remember old things, comprehend them, apply them, and speak them. Because if that's true, then if we are to be like the apostles and receive the Lord's promise in today's dispensation, then we must fill our mind with things to remember and become a master of them. Because when you read of the occasions when the apostles were brought before governors and kings, and when the apostles spoke, there's nothing new that they spoke. They were just given the ability to remember and remember succinctly in order to understand, apply, and speak to those they were speaking to. And that's a great promise which we can share today. It's not just limited to the apostles. But here's the thing, brothers and sisters. If we don't fill our minds with things to remember, then when we're pushed into the spotlight to speak, what will we say? And if you come back with me to Acts chapter 24, even though Ananias was a master of the law, and Tertullus was a master of the law of Rome, what they underestimated was they were up against a master of both in the Apostle Paul. And now the Apostle Paul is going to be asked to speak. And here's what he's going to say. Further breaking down, the Apostle Paul is going to speak in his defense. Verse 10, a true acknowledgement of who Felix actually was. Verse 11 to 13 is going to give a tactful answer to the charges. Verse 14 to 16, he is going to give a total affirmation to his way of life. And finally, to conclude his argument, verse 17 to 21, he's going to give a torrid appeal. And here now, the Apostle Paul, with the inspired words of the Lord Jesus Christ at his mind, he is going to step forward and he is going to begin his argument this way. Verse 10. Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. You can't help but notice that little sort of subtle dig at Tertullus. Maybe a dig's a strong word, but he says at the end of verse 10, I don't need a Tertullus. I'll answer for myself. And he had acknowledged that it was true, Governor Felix was a judge unto the nation. But do you notice what kind of judge had the Apostle Paul called Governor Felix? There's no adjective. He didn't say, oh, you're a lovely judge. Oh, you're just the best. He just said, it is true that you are a judge. But I'll leave it up to the minds of this room to understand very perfectly what kind of judge you actually are. And it's so remarkable to think that that of Tertullus, feigned adulation, and that of the Apostle Paul, true acknowledgement. But what the Apostle Paul did say is, Felix, you will have to decide on a verdict. And here's what I have to say. Verse 11. Because that thou may understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. And notice the word neither. And they neither found me in the temple, disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues nor in the city, and neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. And you notice, brothers and sisters, 12 and 13, 4 times the Apostle Paul is going to use this word neither. Now, why do you think the Apostle Paul uses 4 times this word neither? Because they had laid 4 charges against the Apostle Paul. And each of those neithers is going to be the way in which he refutes them. And he began by saying that, look, Governor Felix, I've only been in the land of Israel for 12 days. And the Apostle Paul could validate what he had done on each of those 12 days. And this is on the Bible marking sheet. You see, the Apostle Paul was able to show that on day 1, he arrived at Jerusalem. On day 2, he visited with James and the elders. Then on days 3 to 8, he had days of purification and 2 days, 1 each, before the brethren on the steps of the Antonia fortress and 1 before the council in their council chamber. On day 9, he left under the cover of night for Cesarea Maritima. Then he arrived in Cesarea Maritima. He spent 2 days in Herod's judgment hall, and now he was before Felix. And what's this called in a court of law, brothers and sisters, when you can show where you were when you've been accused of something? An alibi. He could show the Apostle Paul that he had an alibi as to what he was doing, and he could show it day by day. And so it's not like in verse 11, the Apostle Paul saying, well, let me just go over my quick calendar here. No, he was saying, here's my alibi. And here is where I was each and every one of those days. Now, what's he going to do about these 4 charges? You see, the Apostle Paul, they said he was a pestilent fellow. But in verse 12, neither found they him disputing with any man. Tertullus had said that he was a mover of sedition, but neither was he raising up the people. They said he was a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, but neither could they find him in the synagogues or city recruiting. And finally, brothers and sisters, they said that he had gone about to profane the temple, but neither had he done anything of the sort. In fact, he was upholding the traditions in that very temple they said he profaned. And when you go through verse 12 and 13, and you link up those neither statements, the Apostle Paul is refuting that what they have laid as charges against him, he says it's not true. They cannot find it. And so here's the question. If what Tertullus had said was not true about the Apostle Paul, then what was? What was the truth of the Apostle Paul's religion? And this is a masterclass in terms of laying a defense. Because they said, Tertullus, that the way of Paul was a new way. But Paul is going to say, actually, it's just the old made new. Because in verse 14 to 16, this is what the Apostle Paul is going to affirm about his way. Verse 14 of Acts 24. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets, and have hope towards God, which they, the Jews themselves, also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. And herein do I exercise myself, to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. And here's what the Apostle Paul has just said. Verse 14, the way that he followed was actually the way of the fathers. So who's that? That would have been men like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David. Verse 14, it was the way of the law. Who's that? That would have been Moses. And finally in verse 14, it was the way of the prophets. Well, who's that? Men like Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel. And finally, verse 15, it was the way of the Jews themselves. And so what the Apostle Paul has done with those charges, he says, okay, yes, I am following the way. But guess which way it is? It's the way of the Jewish fathers, the Jewish law, the Jewish prophets, the Jewish people. But why it seems new, when in fact it's old made new, is verse 15, it centers on the resurrection. And that resurrection was only made possible by one man. And that resurrection will involve two classes of people. And in verse 15, the Apostle Paul says, the just and the unjust. And of this, verse 16, Paul had a conscience devoid of offense. And this way, brothers and sisters, the Apostle Paul is going to lay out for Governor Felix, and Governor Felix himself is going to have to make a decision as to which side that he might fall on. Because what the Apostle Paul says is that at that resurrection of the just and the unjust, there will only be two sides and two outcomes, because those on the left hand will be deemed goats, baptized and unbaptized, responsible and accountable, unjust, Paul's opponents. And those on the right hand, sheep, baptized, responsible, the just. And that's men like the Apostle Paul. And what's remarkable is that Governor Felix, verse 22, is going to hear all these things. He's going to be given knowledge of that way. He's going to tremble as he understands it more perfectly. But then he's going to keep the Apostle Paul in prison, there in Herod's judgment hall, for 2 years. And I'll leave you with this thought, brothers and sisters, that as the Apostle Paul was there in Herod's judgment hall for 2 years, he's going to think that he is reliving the life of one other New Testament character, a man who was apprehended for speaking the truth, a man who was visited by a ruler who had a Jewish wife, a man who was waiting for a convenient season, and a man who was known as the Voice. And who that man is, we will begin in our 5th class, The Trials of Paul, before the Judge.